All right. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, whenever and wherever you're listening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Rob Byer.
And I'm Dan McClure.
And we're going to be talking today about history, morality, ethics, the American West, and Red Dead Redemption. So that's what we're here to do today. Our conversation will largely cover the material that you all have available and that's required for our first week. And we're excited to get into this and looking forward to talking about it. So
the first part we want to go through is thinking about like doing history, writing history, thinking about how to make historical arguments, approaching history, that sort of thing. And there's a few authors that if you were to take like a intro to history, historical methods that you might read. Presnell's The Information Literate Historian is sort of a well-known book. But we can kind of look at a couple quotes in here you get us to thinking about like how history works, but also when we go to talk about the game, how does the game interact with historical questions? The way that we do history, that type of thing. But Presnell says, the study of history is not biased, despite the best attempts and intentions of historians. Each historian's past and present influence the questions he or she will ask about the topics of history under consideration. Meaning that everyone comes to their own topic with their own background, their own set of experiences.
Sure. And
that always informs how you approach a question, right?
Colors the way they look at it.
Yeah, I mean, in this, when we talk about like, the catchphrase of diversity in the workplace and all that stuff, a part of the idea of diversity isn't just some arbitrary, like getting people into a place and it's equal. It's not necessarily that. It's also the functional sense is if you don't have a diverse set of thinkers viewpoints looking at a subject, you're going to miss something because everyone's going to have blind spots. And that's really what, when we think about diversity, but when we're thinking about doing history, we, as a practicing historian or someone who's studying to be a historian or someone who just likes history, you should always approach everything you read and what you learn about thinking about what did this historian bring to the table, and perhaps there are blind spots. It doesn't mean that their history's wrong. It just means that something's missing from it.
Yeah.
Right. There's always instances where you can find a book written 50, 60 years ago that's still useful, and you read it with the idea that there are obvious blind spots in it.
Yeah.
And you can fill in the gaps with newer scholarship.
Do you think that quote about history being sort of free of bias despite the best efforts of historians, do you think that that's because history, at least in principle, tries to approach something like objectivity? Or do you think it's just we're trying to reduce the bias that we know has influenced different people, including ourselves, at different points when we're handling these topics?
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea is admitting that there's always bias in it.
Okay.
Like in admitting that the idea of objectivity is sort of an outdated concept in the sense that there's no way you can measurably be objective.
Okay.
Right. It's everyone's reality sort of is framed a different way, and the best way to approach, to be objective is to consider as many perspectives as you can to get at, kind of answering a historical question.
Okay.
Some of the best histories, I think last time we talked about that Klein book, the year 1177, the year civilization collapsed. Mm-hmm. And what I like about that book, which it's in a time period I don't even study, but fun read, is that half the time he ends a paragraph with, but we don't know. It could be this, it could be this, it could be this, but we don't know. And I think there's a healthiness to that.
Sure.
Because, you could do as much research as possible, but there might be something missing that's not in the archive that could change the whole story. But if you didn't see it, it's not going to enter the narrative.
Yeah. So this is a really good maybe starting point, especially because I think at least some philosophers we want to try to get to something like objectivity, and we think it's at least in principle possible. And so it's maybe a good starting point to think about how our disciplines differ. I really like this idea that you mentioned of we don't know, right? Which is that idea of real epistemic humility, right? Epistemic being related to how you know things or your knowledge. And yeah, I think it's a good attitude to just recognize there's stuff that we might miss, and we don't probably almost never want to be 100% certain of any of these assertions. So please continue.
And I think you see this too with the shift from the history of to a history of, right? Where there's sort of this, you're admitting that, and people should admit that 50 years from now, there'll be a different view of it because the present always influences the way we see the past.
Sure.
But another work by Colin titled "Essaying the Past," and this is really thinking about writing about history. But there's a good chapter in there about historical questions.
Okay.
And historical questions really should be a driving part of a driving force in doing history, in the sense that the question guides where you're going to search for answers, because you could be following one question and then a question pops up within that question which might push you in a different direction, which if we're thinking of these video games, half the time you go on a quest, something interferes with it, and next thing you know you're veering off
on a side quest or a tangent.
And to be honest, I would say everyone who researches, writes, etc., history, or even when you're prepping for a class, you're going off on all sorts of tangents because
it's a familiar phenomenon.
Yeah, new questions always arise, or a work you're not familiar with. But Colin lists sort of 4 good criteria for a good historical question.
Okay.
One is it's answerable in more than one legitimate way, right? So a good question can be open-ended. A good question isn't, what's the color of Napoleon's jacket?
Okay.
It could be, what contributed to the downfall of Napoleon? And all of a sudden that opens up a bunch of different ways to answer that question.
Okay.
A good question resonates beyond its immediate subject and invites consideration of broader historical issues.
Okay.
Arguably, my interest in 1177 BC, the civilization, it's the reason the author even wrote it, where he says in the introduction, he's writing it because of today's sort of environmental sort of, the alarming things happening in the environment today.
Sure.
Politics, resource wars, all that type of stuff. And as a ancient historian, he sees this moment as, hey, we can learn something about the present through learning something about the past.
Sure.
Yeah, and so a good question pulls things together. And what we're going to see this with when we get into Richardson about how she's writing from the present, right? And that's why whenever you do read a history book, you always want to look at the copyright date. Like, when was this written?
Sure.
Most likely the writing started within 10 years of the publication date. And so, a good way to read a history book is to think about what were the decades leading up to the publication date? How might the events of their time influence how they write about, the Renaissance or something like that? A third question, a good question opens windows not only on the past, on the present as well. The last one here, a good question can be answered, right? You can't just create a question that can't be answered. So a good question you can answer it. And there could be multiple answers, but you can actually answer it through arguments and through mobilizing evidence. That sort of thing. And that leads us into there's a recent article by Andrew Denning, Deep Play Video Games and the Historical Imaginary from 2021. And sort of this opening historical question is, how does playing with history mold historical thinking, right? How does playing video games, influence the way people think about history?
Yeah.
The reason why, he brings this up, and it's 2021, video games at this point in time, arguably sell more than film. And so while film and television have, for decades been huge sources of people's ideas about history, video games are increasingly intruding upon and could be outpacing film.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And often these video games, you're inside them. So it's not like you visit Egypt for 2 hours.
Yeah.
You could be visiting Egypt for 50 to 100 hours to 500 hours.
Yeah.
Depending on how long you play in the game, how long you restart characters, that sort of thing. So it's a game changer in the popular sort of dissemination of history outside of academic works.
Yeah, I'm reminded of, you see this online sometimes in discussion boards or just kind of as memes where people will, jokingly say things like, I learned more history from playing Civilization or from playing one of the Assassin's Creed games than I did in my high school history class, right? Now that maybe is a reductive or simplified view of history, kind of like we talked about last time, right? Where it's like an assemblage of facts about the past or something. But certainly there are a lot of people who take that to be the case, that playing these games that are maybe attuned to or present the history of things a certain way was really informative to them about these historical facts or historical periods or individuals. So it's definitely an increasing space.
And I think too, there's such a huge difference between running down alleys and interacting with non-player character NPCs versus reading a paragraph about say, to stick with Egypt, the Egyptian economy in 2000 BC.
Yeah.
Right. It's within the game, you're running down the street and you see the economy. It's within the video game, but you see this. You're in the past. It's like you're in a time machine. And so, again, right or wrong, there's a visceral experience. Playing these games, you're hearing it and seeing it.
Yeah, so it's reinforced in a different way.
Yeah, versus sitting down and reading, a chapter that takes an hour to read or something like that. And the last part here in Denning's piece, I think is important to think about. Whether it's Red Dead or Assassin's Creed. All of these games should be the same way that you would view a historical work. These games tell us more about the historical present often than they do about the past.
Okay.
Right. Say Red Dead Redemption 2, if it was made in 1980, or 1980 versus, 18?
The 1899
or
1800s
or whenever the publication of the game. I think it's...
sorry.
2018?
Yeah, I think so.
There's a huge difference between how it would have been portrayed 20 years, 30 years ago.
Yeah. And
how it would have been portrayed now. Imagine if technologically it was available, say, if you, produced and published the game in the 1950s.
Yeah.
It would be hugely different. Like, again, you can only imagine sort of the historical norms of these eras and how they would infringe upon the gameplay. And so, again, we're always sort of, we want to be self-conscious of that, whether, you're playing a video game and it's within a historical context or even you're reading, historical works. Which brings us to Richardson, and Richardson opens right in that introduction, kind of plays into this idea, like the historical question should have this, should reflect on the present, and undoubtedly always does because of the author's position in the present. But she writes, "This is the book that explains why today's political map looks like a map of the 1860s." And the book really takes place between 1860s to about 1901. And she writes that in 1901, a newly formed middle class had answered the question, right, about the proper relationship between government and its citizens, right, by embracing a worldview that divided the nation into two groups. On the one hand, they believed were hardworking Americans, those who believed that success came through hard work and that all Americans were working their way up together. On the other hand, were special interests, those who believe that there are fundamental conflicts in society that must be adjusted by the federal government, right? And so, in writing this book in a way, and this is sort of the historical, the card you play is, but this is not new. When people are talking about some issue, it's like, it was happening back, 100 years ago, we were experiencing the same thing. Yeah. So it's not new. And so
this reminds me of one of my favorite passages from what people sometimes call the Old Testament or the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible is in Ecclesiastes. A lot of Ecclesiastes is about how there's nothing new under the sun. Everything that has existed, everything that comes up that seems new, that seems novel, that seems interesting, it's been around before, it's happened before. It's all these kind of human universals or commonalities or something. And this kind of this historic approach just strikes me as being very, consistent with that kind of idea.
Yeah, it's humans and their patterns.
Yes.
So another part, right, of this argument, right, was the middle class. This middle class ideology was both the greatest triumph and the greatest tragedy of Reconstruction. And so, why is that? Because everyone, wants to believe that hard work will lead to success.
Yeah.
But the tragedy of Reconstruction is sort of the historical burden that came with the post-Civil War, the Reconstruction era.
Sure.
It's sort of the moment when an ideal cannot really keep the forces of history at bay. You might want to believe in the ideal, but there's certain things in play that perhaps don't allow that ideal to
come to fruition.
In certain groups.
Sure.
And so we want to keep that in mind. And as I say that, I'm thinking of, there's all these conversations in Red Dead Redemption 2 where they are talking about this, right? Especially Dutch.
Yeah, by this you mean just like what, like the vision of America or the vision of what life could be like, or kind of all of that.
Yeah, all that kind of is woven through.
We're the last outlaws. We're the last ones. We don't want to go east because that's where civilization is. That kind of stuff.
Yeah, and then they're coming. They're chasing this ideal.
Yeah.
That also happens to include we got to rob and do crime in order to get that ideal.
Right. And it's appropriate for us to do it in a certain way.
Yeah, right? and we're the good. I think we've had this conversation.
Yeah.
We're a different sort of gang.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. There's. We'll talk more about the game later, but just this part of the conversation is reminding me that when Arthur and the gang first saved Sadie, one of the things that Arthur says is, "We're bad men, but we're not like them, like the O'Driscolls and how they were treating her."
Yeah.
And so it's like gives this idea of like a tiered. But it's also probably this idealization that even though we're bad in a certain way, we really think we're good because we're living this authentic, genuine, true, rugged individual kind of life or something. So.
Yeah. And that arguably could be a part of the myth that the game drew upon.
Sure.
Right? Because
there is of the revisionist Western that some of our authors were talking about.
And I think it's shown in sort of the, we love movies, entertainment about gangsters.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But good gangsters have codes. Bad gangsters are
that's right.
Right, nihilistically destructive.
Chaotic.
Yeah. And so there's always this very American kind of, and perhaps it's very
even
human,
broader or something. For
but
sure,
but
yeah.
at least in the United States, it's a very like we love a good criminal as long as they're not doing.
As long as they've got a code.
Yeah, they better have a code.
And at least some of it should overlap sufficiently with our own conventional moral code.
Yeah, they should be hardworking criminals.
Exactly, yeah.
But going into that chapter 1, the main thing when we talk about the Civil War and how does the Civil War change the United States? Obviously, there's a war. Enslaved people are freed from bondage after, I think it's 254 or 56 years of slavery in North America. There's also a readjustment of these values, which I think that's for Richardson's getting to that point. Right, this is the beginning of this shift of how a middle class ideal, which obviously begins before the Civil War, but by the turn of the century going into the 20th century, there's definitely this a more updated version of a middle class ideal.
Yeah.
And she highlights there's sort of this the difference between the North and the South. Southerners believed they're the inheritors of the founding fathers' ideals, which in some ways they were. They believed in a slave republic, right? Slavery wasn't sort of a contradiction. This idea that equality between white men could only exist with slavery.
Yeah.
Right. Which again, I mean, from the philosophical, and I just team taught a class on Plato. That I couldn't stop thinking about that as I read through Plato and sort of this larger Greek world. This is all built on some half the population or so or more is enslaved, but they have these sort of ideas that we still are drawn to about the republic and freedom and democracy and all that kind of stuff. So it seems like it's like that haunts very much so the United States and this trying to uphold this ideal. Yeah. And the struggle is, what do we do with this thing called slavery? Yeah. How are we the good guys in this story if there's enslaved people? Yeah. Right. And
this goes into how Richardson discusses that a lot of the sort of ways of thinking about this were that this is for the enslaved people's own good, right? Yeah. This is they're going to actually get the best out of this arrangement as opposed to that free labor system in the North where you just have owners exploiting their employees. Here we have it's almost like a noblesse oblige, right? This hierarchy of nobility, and part of our obligation is to take care of those who can't take care of themselves, which they would have defined as all of those enslaved peoples. Right?
Yeah, and so this, obviously in this time, women are deemed children, people of color are deemed children, children are children, and so that sort of justifies this this hierarchy.
Yeah. Well, this reminds me of in Richardson when she was talking about the letter from. I'm so bad remembering names. Wade, I think, was one of the kind of landed gentry in the South. We have a lot of letters from him and his family, and he was writing to one of his sisters who never married, and he just says, "I feel it's my obligation to take care of you, almost like a father and like a brother, but it's because he thought they couldn't take care of themselves, right? And I have this obligation to care for you." And so I just thought that was telling about how the kind of way of thinking that was very prevalent at that time.
Yeah. And then thinking about the slavery part, and I think a part of the narrative to justify all this, of course, is ideas of race that come about, somewhere arguably before, there's versions that go back and, the Irish become this other that the British, they justify taking over Ireland and doing their own, the Ulster Scots, right? But slavery in North America definitely generates this idea of race, of sort of an anti-blackness that creates the binary of, whiteness equals freedom, blackness equals enslavement. That anchors sort of, right, the psychology of the nation, but especially in the South because of going into the 1800s, where you have this division between states that have slavery and states that don't.
Sure.
But as she notes here, about 1/4 of all Southern families, white families, owned slaves, but almost all Southern whites bought into the ideology of slavery. Slavery fed the psychological and economic needs of poor whites as it supported the social, economic, and political power of planters. And this is the crucial point. For poor whites, slavery reinforced the idea that all whites, rich and poor, were equals. Right? And that to me is this sort of, that helps solidify the ideal. Right? You can have the ideal of sort of all men are created equal only if you have a regime of slavery that is race-based and that gives this psychological out for poor whites, that they can at least understand themselves as not being a part of this other classification of people.
Yeah. So there's still some kind of dignity on the basis of those external traits or something like that. Yeah, I thought, so this was an interesting thing for me to think about, because again, I'm not a historian, and so this is certainly not my background. So one thing about this that I was thinking about just as you mentioned it is her discussion that only 4% of white Southern men owned 20 or more slaves necessary to be considered a member of the planter class. So that, I mean, again, obviously, even if 25%, right, of Southerners owned slaves, that's still a pretty significant chunk of the population. But it also, I think, just that I found that surprising, just because I had thought that was much more widespread. That there were these massive, huge sort of plantations with lots of slaves. And I think I guess I thought that was interesting, and I'm curious what you think about this, is like how this relates to, that idea that one way to think about this is a lot, and this is certainly how at least some of the radical Northerners thought about this is a problem for the South, but the problem is most pronounced among this very elite, only a few members of the, just in terms of population, were the ones that were responsible for so much of this, exploitation and stuff. That, again, these poor white Southerners were tacit and endorsed and were important to them, but that they weren't, in a certain way, they weren't really getting many of the benefits of this exploitative practice. So I just thought that was really interesting as a part of Cox Richardson's book that I didn't know anything about or didn't know sufficiently about. So how do you think about that in terms of how this idea relates to, this idea, right, of the race-based difference and moral worth or moral status is the thing that, was it sort of the thing that made it, okay to be a poor white Southerner that has nothing, that is, right, that you get this reputation of laziness because you have hookworm and all of these things that aren't treated, but you could just say, well, at least I'm not one of those people, right? At least I'm not of that group of people. I still have this thing, this inchoate whiteness or whatever, that makes it so that I'm different, even though the material conditions are really, really poor.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a testament to like the power of culture over, like in debates, debates about, economic interests, or the debates about they're not voting for their economic interests.
Sure.
Well, historically, and especially within the United States, there are plenty of times when people are voting for cultural
Sure.
interests.
Yeah.
And not necessarily economic interests. Whether they know what's at stake economically, whether they think that it's unfair that there's this concentration of wealth.
Sure.
There is, undoubtedly a sense of one day I can be like them, right? And so it's sort of this almost quasi-religious ideological
temporarily
hope.
Inconvenienced millionaire or something.
Yeah, like right now I'm not a millionaire, but I could be. Mm-hmm. And I think that's important to stress. And to me, that's, historically, whether, you're talking about like the labor movement or the social movements in the 1960s.
Sure.
A lot of ways that the populist movement from 100 plus years ago.
Sure.
One of the ways these movements often fail is the burden of like race, which is a cultural sort of embedded psychological construct of seeing the world. So, when we read this, it's, you can't underestimate the role of that and not just write off people as, dumb.
Sure.
I think it's a visceral need to. I'm a part of this society. This is a very glorious society. I think the performance of the Southern gentleman.
Mm-hmm.
I always think of Gone with the Wind, which is a part of that Hollywood revisionist.
Yeah.
It embraced the Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction. Southern historical narrative of the lost cause, and the South was
States'
the wrong.
rights and,
yeah. And so, when you watch that movie, you want to watch it with that sense of what was made at this time when, history books basically said that Reconstruction and giving African Americans rights and letting them vote, that was a big mistake,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Gone with the Wind helps reinforce that.
Sure.
Right. And so, I do think that all this stuff kind of winds together, right? It's there's a cultural thing going on that can't just be unplugged because you have an amendment, because there's a law against it.
Yeah.
There's a war, right? We're arguably still, weaving through all of these ideas going into the present.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, we can look at the Northerners, right, with the free labor economy, and that's sort of the more idealistic, right, a republic that the founder set up, but without slavery. But we also, I think that the part of the scandal of the North is that, especially for industrialism, a lot of the investment and a lot of the raw material, especially cotton, comes from the slave South, right?
Sure.
So it's sort of like we're going to industrialize, but we also need the money that you're making off slavery in the South.
Yeah.
Often racism in the North was worse.
Sure. Because
there wasn't the institution of slavery. Slavery drew boundaries that weren't even drawn in the sense that they were performed, and you had to act them out, right? Hence, the idea of a Southern gentleman having to perform. Right, I have these duties to protect you, and then the enslaved person of African descent that has to perform in a way that gets them through the day, right?
Sure.
But in the North, there's this sort of understanding of freedom that destabilizes something that under slavery is deemed natural, right? Even if it's not, it's the performances to. Whether you're just surviving through the day or you're trying to maintain a system, despite its brutality, that performance, moves through. The North, the performance is dissolves under the weight of this idea that it's not a slave society, which means it's a free society, but racial antagonism still exists and haunts.
Yeah.
And it often comes with a fierceness that slavery created identities, right? If you're, white equals freedom, blackness equals enslavement. But what happens when white and black are not, or white and black are both free? Suddenly, that troubles a very comforting
that kind of binary.
Yeah, it troubles that. So, it's sort of like we're going through these debates with women's rights even today. Should women be working, right? The commencement speech from a week or so ago.
Yeah.
This is still kind of floating around, which is it's always tied to this idea of masculinity. Of how can you be masculine if you're not defined against this other of femininity that is dependent. right? Active masculinity, dependent femininity. So in many ways, again, as we're doing the history, we're constantly haunted by, our own present, that we see these things in the past, and we're still dealing with it.
Sure.
Right? We're still dealing with these ghosts, right?
Sure.
Yeah. The other part too that Richardson goes into is in terms of the federal government, and
I thought that
the
was
war
fascinating.
blows up the federal government because they're fighting a war.
It almost has to,
and it has to, right? Like that's if people don't want big government, they should be anti-war. We've seen that with just about every major war, from Civil War to World War I, World War II. Especially the even post.
You got to have an infrastructure to tax everybody.
War on terror. Think of the expansion of government's reach under the war on terror. So it's this is sort of an
FISA
ongoing.
Courts and
but how to pay for the war? So you have war bonds. And this is something we take for granted, but the idea that there's a national currency, right?
Yeah.
So they issue greenbacks, right?
Yeah.
And then that's this idea that the government will promise to guarantee the value of that.
Yeah.
The other parts, and this really kind of goes into thinking about the West, is the Homestead Act of 1862, the Land Grant College Act of 1862, which subsidizes the creation of colleges out on these western areas, Great Plains, and then railroad legislation, right? All of this is government intervention into trying to get economic activity generated in the West. As we'll see as well, the irony of the West is you need federal intervention and infrastructure development to enable the idea of the rugged individual in the West. Right? There's a great book which we'll probably talk about next week, Limericks. I think it's Legacy of Conquest, about the West. And I think the introduction opens with discussions about, again, it's like diaries and letters back home, but it's talking about a woman who's out in Montana and how all these camps are just littered with cans, right? From canned food.
Sure.
Because that's what they're eating.
Yeah.
But this is canned food that's shipped from the East.
Yeah.
And it's just like, you might move on from your camp, but everyone's leaving these piles of trash behind.
Refuse.
And it's kind of points to this, dependence on the East for goods. But out West, you feel like you're a rugged individual because you don't have you're not readily accessing the comforts, but you're still getting the comforts of the East. And I love that because the first time I was going through Red Dead, it's like there's just trash everywhere. Like there's cans everywhere. You go into the houses and stuff. There's empty cans everywhere. And even you like, I need to up my health, so I can peaches. And you just toss the can down. Someone else will clean it up in 100 years. And so and again, that's that paradox, right? Like the ideal of living through a rugged individualism in the West, but the reality of you can't have any of that without the infrastructure that allows everything to move in a way that the seamlessness allows you to fantasize about the rugged individual ideal.
Sure.
Moving into chapter 2 here. I think the one thing that on the way to getting this this middle class idea in government intervention, right? Because we do have government intervention with post civil rights, that Reconstruction era. Right, under the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands. The South obviously reacts. The rise of the Klan comes right after, at the end of the war. They're sort of a paramilitary organization. But you're also seeing the rise of black codes, and so people of African descent are freed, but these new laws kick in you have to have a job. If you don't have a job, you're deemed a vagrant, and you can be arrested and imprisoned.
Yeah.
And that goes into that 13th Amendment, where the 13th Amendment allows sort of this idea of slavery to survive, but it's linked to criminality. So if you can criminalize a group of people, you can re-enslave them.
Yeah.
In a way. And so this is sort of what's happening in especially in the South. And you get a taste of this kind of, it's a bit whitewashed here and there in Red Dead, right? Again, you can only expect so much from a mainstream game.
Sure.
Right? If you were...
Especially where the point is just to have a good time.
Yeah, it's entertainment.
Like
I think that's the one
right.
thing I missed in that earlier article is at the end of the day, these video games have to be entertaining. So you can only go so far in replicating a past experience.
Sure.
Arguably, if you did Red Dead, the multiculturalism of the gang would be very skewed.
Yeah.
Right? I think Micah is sort of the, quote, bigot of the group. But historically, you'd probably have a lot more people within the group. There might be the one person who might even stay quiet, but they might not be the bigot, right? And
you certainly had individual like abolitionists and stuff, but it was not at all widespread or anything, right? And so,
they're definitely taking liberty, and you have to do that because you can't make a game where
one of the essays talked about that particularly, right? Which is these are areas that there's a lot of unpleasantness, and if we'd reproduced all of this historically in the game, it wouldn't have served the focus of the game, which is to be an entertainment product, right? Whereas you can talk about some kinds of historical unpleasantness, like the Pinkertons and the development of private police forces and stuff. So
you can only do so much.
That's right.
As I've
at the end of the day, it is a game, right?
Yeah.
So,
but the other part of this too is the rise of industrial capitalism, and how this shakes up. And I would say idealized community relationships, because you never want to get into that. Before industrial capitalism, the community worked perfectly, and there was harmony. Again, when we're talking about this middle class ideal and this economic harmony, it's always an ideal because there's always some hidden shadow behind it.
Or you maybe could have it briefly in very specific situations and not in other cases or something, right?
Yeah. But what industrial capitalism...
Just really quickly, when you say industrial capitalism, could you define that for...
So industrial capitalism would be...
Is that distinct from general capitalism or for industrialization or...
Yeah, industrialization, the rise of factories, the rise of sort of, I guess, quote, big business.
Okay.
That's what we're talking about. Yeah, the difference between someone owning a store, and then that store owner orders all these supplies for people,
flour and
and you go in and you kind of you have that thing where just put it on my bill.
Yeah.
And at the end of the month,
credit
you pay your credit. Yeah, you have like a credit with, and you can do that because you know the person, they live in the community.
Exactly. Yeah.
And things work more smoothly that way. Say if you are running into economic troubles, you're farming and something goes wrong, the store owner knows you and understands that, and they can work with you.
Yeah, to help you till you get back on your feet or whatever.
Yeah. And sort of the new era of industrialization where.
So it's more anonymous, more streamlined.
Yeah, and there's
more
an important
faceless.
Yeah, there's an important factor is the rise of managers, right? So the idea that the owner is running the business kind of drifts away, and now you're hiring a manager to run it. Well, the manager has a job to do, and it separates the morality of what they do with impact on the community, right? And so, and the other part too is you're hiring people to do things, and because you're paying them a wage and it's voluntary, it means that they have the right to quit anytime they want. At the same time, you also have, because you're in a position of wealth versus the person who's working for you, you have an easier time creating laws, right? Or getting laws to work for you. So the classic example is the 14th Amendment, where it defined, personhood, citizen. I want to say of the 300 plus cases about the 14th Amendment, I think 16 or so were for African Americans came forward. Their cases came through on the 14th Amendment. All the rest were corporations that were becoming citizens. And once you have a right as a citizen, you are able to do certain things that probably you shouldn't be able to do if you're a massive company, because you're
recognized legally as a person.
Your impact is greater on the community. Just by being how big you are. So these are all these debates that are.
It's also. I mean, it is also the case. I mean, I don't know. Again, this is pretty far outside of my area, but as I understand it, part of that is also so that they can be held responsible the way that you might hold a person responsible, at least in principle. Whether it ever is used that way effectively or not is another question. But is something like that at least part of what's going on there? I mean, again, obviously, the people that are involved that have the money are the ones that are able to just more effectively lobby and shape the laws in the context. That's one of the things I also really enjoyed in Richardson was the discussion of how sort of party politics and government worked at the time, which is if you're in charge, you get to be the one to appoint all of the political individuals, which means really it's going to be you and whoever you like or whoever you want to give influence to, which is going to mean that all of these political positions are filled with people that have the right kind of ideology or background or interest the way that you do.
Or contributed to your campaign, right? It's sort of, it's that. I think with the rise of the corporation in this sense, because there was always corporations, right? Like the Erie Canal was made by an incorporated group of, quote, capitalists, right? Investors pooling capital, creating a corporation, right? It's that whole limited liability. And then, but the old version of that was the corporation, once that job was done, it was dissolved.
Okay.
Right. And so the post-Civil War era is really the rise of sort of a corporation that can't die.
Okay.
Right. And so and then there's the fight to give a corporation sort of the right of a citizen. But the legal makeup of the corporation allows the people that benefit from the corporation not to be liable.
Yes. Yeah.
And so you get to be a citizen, but you don't have the responsibilities of a citizen, because if your company leads to 1 or 20 or 100 or 500 people's deaths, you're not liable for that. The corporation is. And you're separate from that. And so that, and it's in a way that's kind of like today's framework where I think I can't remember the court case from a few years ago. Romney had that famous quote, something like, "No, my friend, a corporation is a person," or something like that, right? Which kind of defined that moment. Right? It's such a good quote. And so we're still dealing with that, but at the same time, a corporation is not responsible. It's responsible to shareholders, and it's not responsible to the community. But it's a citizen. But it's not responsible. So it's like that, and you can imagine in terms of a middle class that, right, you own a store. You don't own a bunch of stores. You're not like, Walmart.
The Waltons.
Right? The Waltons. You own your store. You own your, the gun store, like in Red Dead. That's how I own this store, and I sell you guns. I'll repair your gun. Those are, small scale, skin of their teeth. We made a profit this month. Yay. And you get through the next month. Once these large entities move in, suddenly that disrupts older relationships that allowed you to go in and you'd pay at the end of the month your bill. Because now it's like, well, if you can't pay me now, I can't sell it to you. Right. And this leads to sort of, because the other part of this too is, if we go back to that Civil War moment, is the federal government, the intervention on behalf of what really becomes big businesses. And this is the railroad, especially the railroads. Like the railroads are really the model of the modern corporation, in the sense that you have to have a management system in place that is large in geographic scale. Right. Which, the telegraph is that perfect sort of instrument to be able to communicate over long distances. But the other part of that, and right, this is, you know, a part of that rugged individualism, or the West with the rugged. You can't have the railroad without government intervention.
Yeah.
Right? Without government handing over land, which railroad companies can turn around and speculate with or sell. They can have cities bid over where the railroad will go through town. Yeah. Right? All these kind of dynamics that are kind of hidden from general histories of this period. Sure. The barometer of, you know, discontent comes through both a middle class sort of anxiety about these changes, but also in that kind of, you know, we have a group that works hard, and we have what's that, the special interest groups, and largely a lot of these special interest groups include the populace. Yeah. And so, you know, think of Kansas even, there's populists that are hardworking farmers, want an honest deal, but they're dealing with railroads who they're playing the game. Yeah. And they enjoy sort of the protection, the influence, and the benefits of federal intervention in a way that, say, a small farmer in Kansas, they might have been able to utilize the Homestead Act. Right. They get to utilize the presence of the U.S. military to, you know, ethnically cleanse Native Americans from the area so they can have that land. Right. They do get federal intervention. Yeah. But it's not on the scale that they visibly want to see. That they see. They don't want to see. They don't want to see the federal intervention of, you know, wars against indigenous people that creates the land that they get to farm on. That's sort of invisible, but they do see and kind of think it's unfair that these railroads are protected in a way. Yeah. And that's kind of, you know, that drives a lot of the rhetoric in the late 1800s as we're getting into the game, right? The game was 1899. You know, which is great because it might have been less of a game if it was in the 1880s during that classic period of, quote, the West. Sure. Yeah. But yeah, I think, you know, once you get into this era, these debates about anxiety over the loss of this middle class ideal, challenging groups that interfere with the middle class ideal, the special interests. All that plays into a lot of the rhetoric that we do get to see in the game. Yeah. You know, going back to the railroads, industrialism. The other part of that is the rise of this sort of a white collar class, and we do get to see that in the game. Yeah. Right. These, you know, like the people that go out west and they're all awkward. Yeah. Because they only know, you know, city life, and they went to school, and you know, when we're thinking about clerical workers, bankers, managers, sure, those sorts of things, increased education of women, right? All this is moving along. I think you see that in the, I think a couple of the quests you go on with the abolitionist group, yeah, right, that's right, where that's kind of playing with some of those ideas. But that kind of gets us into the 1870s. But yeah. Well, I was just thinking, I mean, even in terms of Richardson's book, you know, I think, you know, there's discussion, I don't remember if it's in the first or second chapter, about how in the South, when all of the, you know, able-bodied men went to war, what that meant is a lot of the women that were left behind or stayed behind took over more and more of those responsibilities of like managing large, you know, plantations and groups of people and figuring accounts and doing all of this stuff. And I think it was in one of the letters that I think Wade Hampton, I think one of his daughters discusses, which is basically, you know, my mother, right, the woman's mother, took over, and it took her, you know, a little bit to get her bearings, but then she was just as good at it as anyone else, right? So like even in the context of thinking about the role that women were actually playing at some of those times,
it was an expansion of some of that. Not like formal, legally recognized agency, but just as a matter of fact of what they were doing and how they were impacting things. They were doing things that we don't usually associate or think about, like of the genteel Southern woman or something like that, or like Wade Hampton's sisters, which weren't married, were spinsters, lived with him, and kind of depended on him.
Yeah, and I think that's, moments like that, dismantle these ideas of natural things for men and natural things for women, right? Because we see this, World War I, especially World War II, where
sure.
Especially they're keeping track of production,
mm-hmm.
and women working in these factories, like production didn't shift,
yeah,
right, which just undermined all these ideas about like masculine strength in a factory setting.
Sure,
it's like, well, these women, and some of them were married women. They
mm-hmm.
had kids. They had daycares that were a part of the factory.
Yeah,
it undermines. It undermined the reality of the ideal, which was that the ideal is just sort of this kind of constructed, convenient idea to create a hierarchy that suggests an order, right? Mm-hmm. Men do this, women do that.
Sure. To
disrupt that is to disrupt order. You should stay within your sphere.
Yeah, in your lane or whatever.
And so, yeah, and again, if, this game is in the, second decade of the 21st century, if the game was made in the 1980s, would you have seen a Sadie?
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, it's a good question. Or would the, would the suffragettes been portrayed as positively or something?
Yeah. There's a lot of questions that would go into thinking about like
sure.
the what ifs and how sort of the contemporary moment influences the game.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I'll quickly go over, and this wasn't a part of the reading, but it comes from John Will's book that he wrote before the edited collection that we're reading for the class. It's called Gamer Nation from
mm-hmm.
19. It's just sort of a general history. I would assign this if I was just doing a history of video games. But,
sure.
It describes the rise of video games in the 70s, and this kind of video games being like sort of investments, and companies own these games and you sell them and you buy them and they're commodities.
Mm-hmm.
But even these video games are products of federal intervention that come out of the Cold War, the rise of computers. Right, to administer the Cold War.
Yeah.
Right, all that kind of stuff. It's sort of like the birth of the internet comes through federal spending and Cold War ideas and computers and all that kind of stuff. But eventually that spills over into the private sector. So you have the rise of computer space, Pong from 1972.
Mm-hmm.
And he has this notion too, and I think this is important, where he writes something like, video games give us a window into the growing phenomenon in U.S. culture, which is the power of simulation and fakery. Right? So these games early on, even the Atari games, you play them and they're fun, but you would never think that this is some simulation of reality.
That's right. Yeah.
And maybe you might, maybe I'm kind of looking at it from a contemporary lens. Maybe when you're playing the square in Adventure, you are a knight or something like that fighting dragons, but you're still looking at a bunch of squares.
Yeah.
I think the arrival of sort of the 3D games,
mm-hmm.
right, the first-person shooters. And according to Will's, he lists Wolfenstein 3D in 92
mm-hmm.
as one of the early versions. Doom in 93, Quake 96, Unreal 98, Half-Life 98, Medal of Honor 99, and Halo in 2001.
Yeah. Right?
So these games arrive, and suddenly you are the agent in the game, and
it's
not
often from a first-person perspective, so it looks like you're seeing the thing as opposed to a representation where the character you're playing or piloting is on the screen separable from you, right? In a first person, it's just like the game is how you're looking, right? How the character would be looking, which seems to make it more directly connected to I'm in the game as opposed to playing a character that is represented in the game or something.
Yeah, I keep thinking like Pitfall. Like, you aren't the guy in Pitfall. You're controlling the guy in Pitfall.
Sure, yeah.
But if that was a first-person shooter type 3D, it would be a lot scarier because you have to grab the rope and not fall into the thing and get eaten by the alligator and fall.
Sure,
There's certain, if you fall into the thing and there's spiders or critters.
It'd be from your perspective as opposed to some kind of, side-scrolling outside of the game perspective or something.
Yeah, and that's a big sort of, which when you're playing something 3D and all of a sudden you are the thing itself, all of a sudden you are doing things from a personal perspective, which then hits at like your own morals and your own sort of ethics of how you would even deal with certain things. Yeah. So I think this is a good lead into a couple things that I want to talk about from our readings this week. So I'm going to, just as Dan talked briefly about sort of some of the stuff in the history of video games, I do want to just briefly mention, one way to think about this idea of these, 3D games and kind of the first person perspective that ties into the Nguyen reading, the chapter 1 from Games Agency as Art, is this idea that one of the things that games allows us to do is almost inhabit different kinds of agencies or play around with or deal with different kinds of agencies in a way that Nguyen ultimately argues and thinks we're kind of like, part of this is like practice for real life to build our own sense of agency, our own understanding of what we can and can't do. I think this does, as you said, when you're in the kind of first person perspective, it does immediately lead you into thinking about, what if I'm no longer just sort of controlling the character, but I am the character in a certain way, or that's how it appears to me, then the moral decisions I have to make seem to more be on me as opposed to the character, right? And so I think this leads us into thinking about, the second major kind of part of our class. If you think of this class as like, having 3 tent poles or whatever. One is probably Red Dead Redemption 2, and one is history, and then the other is this particular area of philosophy that we think about in terms of morality and ethics. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to try to talk about in detail all of the articles that you were assigned. What I do want to do is just kind of talk about some of the commonalities, because I think that those are just helpful things to kind of get us started to do moral reasoning. So, one thing I'll mention right off the bat is sometimes people are really precise with their use of the terms morality and ethics. So sometimes people, for example, want to say, well, morality is about what's right and wrong, or it's about interacting with others. Morality is about what kind of rights can I demand that you accept of mine and vice versa. And those same kind of people will sometimes say ethics isn't really about that. Ethics is about good and evil as distinct from right and wrong. It's less about something like, my social behavior, and it's more just like, how do I live a good, fulfilling life? In our class, we're just going to kind of use those interchangeably. We're going to just talk about them as if they're roughly the same thing, because a lot of people think of value theory as containing both of those things, right? What is intrinsically good? What is valuable? And then when I'm navigating this in a big social system with other people, well, what are the right and wrong ways for me to act? Whether I'm pursuing those intrinsic goods or I'm disagreeing with others about the intrinsic goods or something like that. Intrinsic, just as a side note, you can contrast it with the idea of something that's instrumental. So things, if they're intrinsically valuable, we mean that they're valuable for their own sake and not because they do some other thing. Whereas something like, say, the pen I'm holding might be instrumentally valuable. I value it because it allows me to do other things, right? It lets me write stuff, it lets me communicate. But when my pen runs out of ink, I'm not going to hold a funeral for it and mourn it, because I don't usually think it has intrinsic value in and of itself. So just with that little bit of terminology out of the way, one of the articles that you all read for this week had to do with
It was in fact called like a moral primer, a primer of moral vocabulary. And the basic idea there, I don't want you to, we don't want to be too hard on, did we use exactly the right word? But we really just want to get a grasp of concepts, right? And so the big concepts that I think are useful for us is when we're evaluating morally an action or a person or an event, however you want to describe that, we're trying to think in a few different categories, right? One is what is either, sometimes people call this obligatory, morally obligatory, or what is an obligation that I have. And the idea there of something being morally obligatory or is like being required. That if it's morally obligatory, for example, that I respect your right of free speech, that means if I don't, I've done something wrong, right? It's a requirement. I have to do it. And if I don't do it, then I have failed in some significant moral way, right? If I have not done what I'm morally required or obligated to do, what Shafer-Landau, one of our authors, talks about as what is my duty, right? What is my moral duty? You can also think of a class of things that we would consider morally permissible or allowable. So those things are not things that we have to do, but they're things that we can do, right? So there's a lot of non-moral or amoral behavior that is morally permissible. I don't think I do anything wrong, say, by going out into the hallway and refilling my glass with water from the drinking fountain. I'm not required to, right? No one would say you have to do it from there, but no one would say you've done something wrong by doing that, right? So it would be morally permissible. I'm not doing anything wrong. It's allowed morally for me to do it, but I'm not required to do it. Moral acts, which you might say are morally forbidden or morally impermissible, are just the opposite of, if an act is not morally permissible, it means you don't get to do it. And of course, actions where you fail your moral obligations are morally forbidden, you ought not do them, or something like that. You're going to see when we read, and I think it's natural for us to talk and use terms like what you ought to do or what is the right thing to do. And those things, we're going to kind of use them interchangeably. They're basically just this sort of evaluative, what sometimes you might call normative as opposed to descriptive idea about these moral concepts. So if such and such is the right thing to do, then that also you might think means I ought to do it, which also might mean it's the right thing to do or it's a good thing to do or something like that. So there's other stuff in that moral primer. Mostly I just want to give us a vocabulary to use going forward, both in our discussions and papers and when all of you are analyzing stuff. And of course, when Dan and I are analyzing stuff, right? It's just helpful to think about, is this the right thing to do? Is it morally appropriate, etc. Another thing that I want to talk about, and this is more related to the Tom Regan piece that we assigned, is this idea of what moral reasoning is. And I really want to kind of focus on that idea of reasoning, because one of the things that, I've taught a lot of ethics classes in my time here at Fort Hays. And one of the things that I think, once you can get over the hurdle in a class of getting students, and this isn't just sort of in teaching, right? This is also just in talking with people. Once people are comfortable with each other, they're more than happy to give their opinion, right? To talk about, this is what I think is the right thing to do, or this is what I think is the wrong thing to do, or whatever. But that's like the starting point, right, of moral conversation. That's usually not the ending point. And so when we think about moral reasoning, just giving your opinion isn't enough, right, to really be engaging in moral reasoning. Similarly, you might think about, so this is again thinking about the Regan, and when we talk in the next few weeks about, feminist approaches to ethics, we can certainly come back to this and virtue ethics approaches. But one thing we also want to think about commonly is our emotions by themselves are also not just a guide or a substitute for moral reasoning. Doesn't mean your emotions are not important. It doesn't mean emotions don't tell us really important things about the world. And it doesn't mean you don't have the right to feel the way that you feel, right? It's just that if I'm reading the Richardson book and the discussion of slavery makes me uncomfortable or it makes me feel bad about myself or about my forebears or something, that feeling itself isn't an argument to stop reading it or an argument that she's done something wrong or that you shouldn't have to deal with this or confront it, right? And so the mere fact that when we talk about a moral view or a situation and it makes you feel a certain way, that also is not a substitute for moral reasoning or sort of complex or sophisticated moral engagement. Again, there's more to say here as there is for all of this stuff, but that's one of our starting points. And And I think another thing to think about in the Regan is, and again, this comes up in the Shafer-Landau, is this idea of reasoning. So, I think both Dan and I really want you all to when you're playing the game, when you're reading the text, when you're reading about these real occurrences that happened in history, right? In addition to the fictionalized ones that you're engaging with in the game, we do want you to engage in some moral evaluation and some moral analysis. But we also want you to engage in this in a way that engages moral reasoning, right? And so part of what that would be doing is to say, I think this particular thing is wrong, right? I think this is morally wrong. But then, if we were in person, I would be the annoying guy that said, okay, but why? And, people sometimes find that frustrating. I know when I was growing up, my father found it very frustrating. He'd say, hey, you can't get a ride into town. I'd say, why? So I don't want to do it. But why is that a good reason? So not always good for your interaction with others to just constantly ask why. But in this class, what we're trying to do is really get you to engage in moral analysis and evaluation. And part of that is going to be giving reasons for why you think the view you have is the right view, right? Giving reasons why you think, again, all of us, I think, are probably on board with, it's very intuitive to think that slavery is morally wrong, right? We can give reasons for that, but for some of us, it might seem so obvious and so deep-seated that we just think, well, look, obviously it's wrong, let's move on. I'm certainly not saying we need to have an argument about whether slavery is wrong. I'm just saying in general, when we think about whether something is right or wrong, we don't want to just stop at this is what I think. We don't want to just stop at this is my opinion. We don't want to just stop at this is what most people around me think or what is conventional or what I heard a pastor or priest or teacher or parent or whatever say. We want to really kind of think about that and interrogate it and provide reasons of why we think we do. Why we think, what we think, right?
So sort of an opinion versus an argument.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah.
We don't really care about opinions.
Yes.
What we want is an argument.
Yes.
So as long as you can throw your opinion out, but if there's no argument behind it, it doesn't really.
It's just not as interesting, and it's also not. There isn't as much to talk about, right? I mean, if all we do is stop at I think this and you think that, great. But what are we going to do with the rest of the podcast or the rest of the class or the rest of our time, right?
Yeah.
So if I say I think this and you say, ooh, I don't think that's true. Well, then you probably want me to convince you. You want me to give some reasons and evidence, marshal things together. In the same way that if I, am reading something, I go, ooh, I'm not sure about that. Part of what we're doing when we reason is we're convincing each other. We're not only doing that, we're kind of convincing ourselves, right? I mean, certainly a lot of beliefs that I had and still probably have, I just kind of absorbed, like a kind of cultural osmosis. And a lot of those I did not reflect on very carefully. So I give an example sometimes in classes where, my father growing up was like, he had very strong opinions about which kind of motorcycle is the best kind of motorcycle or what kind of beer is the right kind of beer to drink. And I think I just absorbed them. I didn't think about them. They were his. And I just parroted those things for a long time. Over time, as I became more reflective, I started thinking, why do I believe that? So he said it. He asserted it. Why do I think it's true? And some of those things I ended up rejecting because I thought there is no good reason for me to think this. Other things I found there was a good reason, I just didn't have it at the time, right? But that whole process of giving reasons for why you think certain things is not just important socially in interacting with others and explaining your view to others and getting them to understand and make intelligible your view. It's also important for you to make sure that the things you believe for good reason, right? Yeah. And this is a practice that we're going to engage in this class, is try to give reasons for our views.
Yeah,
right?
and it ties back to that historical question, right? Like,
sure, absolutely.
Historical questions. To answer the question, you should, multiple versions of an answer. Mm-hmm. But your answer has to have evidence. So you're always mobilizing evidence on. You have a historical question and you have a thesis. Like, this is the question I ask. This is my answer, but I'm going to answer it using this evidence.
Yeah.
And not just, I have a historical question and then I'm going to give an opinion on it.
Exactly.
And then that's where it ends.
Yes.
Because then the debate then enters into the realm of evidence. Mm-hmm. Is it the right evidence? Mm-hmm. Is it a misinterpretation of the evidence?
Yeah.
I look at that same document and I see something else.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you go back and forth.
And so then again, I think, though, reason enters into the space there too, right? Which is, if we're both looking at the same document and I say, oh, I interpret that very differently, it's very natural to go, oh, okay, well, let's talk more about it so I can understand why you have such a different interpretation, right? And that's going to, sometimes it might involve giving evidence, but it also just might involve giving reasoning and constructing, like, why do I think this is a better interpretation than that or something? So I think, and this is just kind of a general philosophy thing, we really want arguments. We really care about reason. Now, of course, reason is not the end-all be-all. It is not the perfect, I think we've historically sometimes thought about reason as, this totally perfect thing that never has any problems. And obviously that's not true. Like, we're flawed and we act irrationally and stuff. But aspirationally, we can sure try. And we certainly want it as much as we can get it, right? And so that's what I'm going to suggest we try to do in this class as well. Another thing that I think I want to mention from, from the readings from this week, one thing that we're gonna start with and that's gonna come up is probably these big questions about the areas of ethics. So Shafer-Landau, and I think a couple of the other readings we have this week, they make these distinctions between ethical theory, applied ethics, and meta-ethics. So ethical theory is what you're going to be reading about in the next few weeks, which is these kind of big theories about, if I think an action is right or wrong, how do I evaluate that and develop, a principle or a system that gives me an answer of how I should evaluate morality or moral situations. So when we talk about consequentialism or utilitarianism, we talk about deontological or Kantian ethical theory or virtue ethics, and even certainly feminist ethics, what we're thinking about is these big kind of whole theories that we use to then figure out, in a particular case, is this thing the right or wrong thing to do? That's ethical theory. Applied ethics is usually this thing that we would either take an ethical theory or we would take a kind of philosophical, right, this kind of moral reasoning approach to a specific contemporary applied issue and see what comes out. So, one of the things we see a lot in this game, and that I noticed a lot of discussion, like I really like the discussion in Richardson of how voting often occurred. It was just this massive drunken mess, right? People would literally say, hey, it's a voting day, keep your children inside, don't keep everybody away because all the voters, they're just getting plied with whiskey to vote the right way or something, right? And of course, in Red Dead Redemption, we see the way that alcohol is consumed to refill various meters and to do different things. And even outside of that, you just see people in the game who seem to be, who we would, of course, now we would talk about this as they have an alcohol use disorder or something, but we would historically, they'd be called drunks or something like that, right? So thinking about this, in bioethics this last year, one of the things we talked about when we talked about organ donation was, is it morally appropriate to put a person who has end-stage liver disease, if it's alcohol related, should they go lower on the transplant list than someone who also has end-stage liver disease, but it's not alcohol related, basically? That's a very concrete, specific, practical issue in society. Now, you could just have an immediate reaction, right? You could say, well, I think it should be this way, right? You could give your moral opinion about it. But part of what we're going to try to do in that applied ethics area is say, here's a specific issue. Let's actually try to either use an ethical theory or develop and deploy ethical reasoning to try to figure out what the right thing to do is, right? So a lot of that stuff that we do implicitly or intuitively, or we just have that first reaction, applied ethics is saying, let's look at specific issues, whether it's the death penalty or euthanasia. It doesn't always have to do with death. Right? You can talk about should psychoactive substances be legal beyond alcohol or something. All of those are issues where not only the legality part, right, but just is it right, is it appropriate? You can do kind of applied ethics to those things instead of these big general theoretical things. The final thing that I just want to mention is meta-ethics. And I mention it because sometimes I think it gets run together, and I just have a very good feeling that we're going to need to talk about it. Meta-ethics, it's basically the idea of what is the status of a moral judgment. So for example, suppose that I think, as we said earlier, right, almost everybody, I think, thinks this, that slavery is wrong, is morally wrong. Right? Not just that it's illegal, but that it's immoral, that it violates human dignity, that it strips people of autonomy, that it fails to recognize moral worth sufficiently, however you want to describe it. So a meta-ethics question might be, okay, suppose you and I, Dan and Rob, think slavery is wrong. What is the status of that judgment of that it's wrong? Like, what makes it wrong, right? So one thing we could say, we could have a meta-ethical view that we could call subjectivism, which is just whatever I think is right or wrong for me, and it governs me, but not really anybody else. Or we could be cultural or ethical relativists, and we could say, well, certainly some societies have thought slavery is wrong, but other societies have thought slavery is right. And what makes an action right or wrong, or what makes a situation right or wrong, is just the attitude of the group, the cultural commitment, whatever it is, right? And notice that in those cases, there's not disagreement about whether slavery is wrong. What the focus is on is what makes it wrong. And in the first case, our subjectivism case, it's my opinion. In the second case, it's, well, what makes something right or wrong is essentially the mass opinion of a culture or a society. And so in that case, if we have a society that is pro-slavery, slavery is morally appropriate in that society. And if we have one that's anti-slavery, the idea that slavery is morally forbidden or morally impermissible would be right for that society, whatever that means. The reason that I'm mentioning this is, and this is something that Shafer-Landau talks about, issues about metaethics are incredibly complex, and there's no doubt that we're going to get into them, right? Like, it's hard. I would think it would be hard to do this kind of class, being comparing historical periods, comparing different kind of cultural attitudes, and not talk a little bit about some metaethical stuff. Part of the reason I want to talk about it is it isn't the case always, right? I mean, moral realism is another metaethical theory that just says moral claims are objective in the sense that they're independent of individual preference or like social preference or social attitude or something like that. You don't have to endorse something like that. But I think that when we talk about metaethics, part of the reason to think about it is because sometimes a certain kind of skepticism about the idea of moral reasoning can come from certain metaethical views. So if I think that if I think that ethics is just like my opinion about what my favorite ice cream is or whether or not I like broccoli, then it kind of seems weird to argue about it, right? I mean, part of why you and I might argue about some moral matter, Dan, or you and I, right, student listening, might argue about something, is because we think one of us is wrong and we want to communicate it. And certainly, if I have a moral view and there's a possibility I'm wrong, I want to think about, like, how might that change? Like, I want to be right about this stuff, whatever that means. So I want to talk about it and figure it out. Well, I'm not as interested in like having a long discussion where you try to persuade me that my preferences aren't my preferences really, right? Because what are we doing there? It's very strange as a phenomenon. The disagreement makes sense if we think there's something we're disagreeing about, right? Which is what the right thing to do is in a situation or how we ought to evaluate this situation or something. So this isn't, the metaethics stuff is not a plea or to tell you, for example, that you can't be subjectivist or you can't be a relativist. There are all kinds of metaethical positions that are perfectly rational and sophisticated. The point, I think, of talking about it, and the reason that Shafer-Landau spends some time talking about this, is he thinks it actually is not going to be very helpful for our attempt to take moral reasoning seriously and engage with one another if we think it's all basically just our own opinion or something like that. So those are those big three areas of ethics. A lot of our reading is really going to be on ethical theory. We'll do a little bit of metaethics next time, or sorry, not next time, but at the very end. But I think those questions will come up, and certainly when we apply these ethics things to particular parts of the game or particular parts in history, we will essentially be doing applied ethics, right? We'll be applying ethical theory, your own individual intuitions, what your ethical precepts that you've taken that are not from our textbook, but that are just things that you have developed over time or whatever, and applying them to issues. So we're really going to be kind of getting into all of these big areas of ethical theory in the course. And of course, the video game Red Dead Redemption is Red Dead Redemption 2 is just a treasure trove of interesting ethical dilemmas and ethical issues, and there's a lot of fodder for ethical analysis in Red Dead Redemption, which I think really kind of leads us naturally to our one of our textbooks from the class. But before we go on, I just spent a lot of time talking. Dan, did you have any questions or thoughts about any of that stuff that you wanted to flesh out or maybe push back on or just think about more further before we go on?
No, I mean, this is, as I'm almost a student in this too. I
Sure.
never, I think my philosophy extended to the critical thinking class that I passed with a C.
Sure. Yeah.
But no, I think there's going to be a lot to work with in the game because, I mean, there are moral decisions you can make on your own, but there are so many quests where you're forced into a situation that you end up doing
basically
something.
no agency.
Yeah, you. It's like all of a sudden you are now an avatar. You are someone's controlling you as an avatar.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because you have to complete the quest. To complete the quest, you have to do things that you could argue are morally wrong. And
Absolutely.
I think that a part of, in this, as a college class, a part of going through the process and the readings and the thinking that we want the students to go through is to be able to put life into some of these concepts.
Absolutely,
right?
100%.
I think that the cultural relativism and the subject,
the big meta ethics stuff.
Yeah, I think that the game allows you to dip your toes into it.
Oh, absolutely.
In a safe space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right, because and it allows you to kind of at least occupy that zone.
Sure.
Especially
of
if
a
you're
different set of values, of a different.
Because I do. It's you hear debates about usually it's in a political situation, but like, oh, they're cultural relativists or something,
Sure,
and usually and that's used to usually it's used to like sling mud at someone.
Mm-hmm.
So
absolutely, yeah.
One person's cultural relativist is also another person's, well, the founders had slaves because that was the times.
Sure.
So
absolutely.
You could be someone who in the present is against cultural relativism, but
but doesn't want to be too anachronistic. When looking back
and
in the
go,
past
well,
that
was they had slaves. That was the way it was back then, and so it's, I think being able to delve into that, the game will allow you to delve into that and kind of feel it. Yeah. Without, there's always that thing. I think a part of a good video game makes you do things you would never do. Yeah. And you learn something about yourself. Yeah. About, you go through an instance and that will stick with you, right? I think anyone, especially anyone in the class that's played the game already, you already have moments in your head that stuck with you, especially that first time when you play through where everything is so new and something happens and, or I always think of a game that makes you jump as if you're watching a horror movie. Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm. To me, that really means the game is hitting you at, again, it's that, I don't know, I keep using the word, it's a visceral. Sure. You have no control over, at a certain level, you don't have control over your responses. Yeah. And I think, and all video games do that, but I think an important part of this class is being self-conscious of that. Absolutely, right? Yeah. Reflective of it, yeah. And I think that's, partly with, we want you to do this diary that you're in character. And that will allow you to kind of separate yourself because you can think about what you're doing, but you're also thinking about as that person, as this person playing this game and having to do these, morally questionable things. Yeah. Suddenly how are you going to justify that in the diary? Yeah. Because there's nothing wrong with in the diary saying, I can't believe I did that. I feel awful. That's right. Or because you're reading all this stuff, you could apply the theory and say, well, I did that because... Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And when we're grading you on the diary part, that's what we want to see. Mm-hmm. We want to see you playing with these concepts, right? You don't want to write a diary entry that's like, that was bad, period, next page. That's right, yeah. Right? We want you to, be self-conscious, be inside that. And, engage. Yeah. Take it seriously. Yeah, so that really brings up just one or two other things that I actually just kind of forgot to mention. I really like what you said there about this idea of, we want people to just be reflective and this does... The engagement with the game allows, I think, a kind of exposure to behavior that,
hopefully most of us never have to deal with, right? Which is being thrust into a situation where you've got to kill a bunch of people or something like that, right? The other thing that I was thinking about that I didn't mention yet, and I think we should, is, the pre-readings that you all got and really the way that a lot of Red Dead Redemption portrays ethics is this idea of kind of a cowboy code of ethics, right? I mean, that's mentioned even in our early readings in that first section of the Red Dead book. But it's also something that, again, there's this myth, this idealized rugged individualism. And a lot of times that comes hand in hand with this idea of, well, these are the ethics of a cowboy, right? These are real cowboy ethics or something like that. And I think there are even current states that have incorporated cowboy ethics as part of their, this is our state code or something like that, right? I think it's Wyoming that has this as a central part, like some, city or some state agency has said, we endorse this is our thing, right? And this very generic idea of a cowboy code of ethics, we gave you a few examples of it. And we gave you kind of a more sophisticated, I put in the Cowboys Havamal, which is a translation by this guy whose grandfather was kind of a ranch hand or a rancher. And so he's really translating this like Norse collection of wisdom, which includes a lot of practical kind of ethics advice, but in kind of the vernacular of a cowboy, right? And there is a sense, again, of individualism, of like honor and loyalty, right? This idea that there's tiers of we're bad men, but not like them, right? This code that they're living with. And part of the reason we assign that is because we think this is kind of often the implicit attitude about ethics that is given in the game, and that people often associate with kind of this mythic revisionist Old West, right? American West history. And we don't think it's not that we think you shouldn't endorse or think about that. It's more that that's I think on our view, that's one way of thinking about the ethics here, but we really want to try to go beyond that and expand your understanding. So, that kind of cowboy code of ethics, we just don't want to stop there, right? That's not the final story. That's not the final word when we're doing this. We want to use those other things too. So I just wanted to mention that before we get down to talking about some of the essays in this book.
Yeah, so. and I think too we want to see all that as this ideal.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
It's sort of the ideal of the heroic ideal that helps to organize society, helps to give it a code. Mm-hmm. I think we need to understand it as existing outside of reality. It might intersect with reality at various moments, but it's still sort of a constructed ideal.
Sure.
And there's a lot of baggage that doesn't intersect with it. So
absolutely,
especially in the prep for this class, reading a couple sort of big histories of the West. I'm thinking of the Alamo, right? Mm-hmm. The Alamo is this kind of patriotic, especially very Texas patriotic moment. But if when you start reading the history of it, it's the Mexican government didn't want. They were basically going there to enforce the law that you couldn't have slaves, and it was really a war by sort of Anglo-Americans to protect their slavery, right? That changes it. I mean, when you frame it that way, it changes the way that you would remember.
Of course,
to remember the Alamo, it's they were slave owners.
Sure. It isn't just like a last stand of few against
many.
Yeah,
it's not like it's not like making this good or bad, but this is how history works, right? Like
sure.
Our image of the Alamo, whether it's the John Wayne movie or the one that came out like 15 some odd years ago, mm-hmm. which I haven't seen that one. I've seen parts of most of the John Wayne one, but it's right. Those are versions of this type of game, mm-hmm. right? Those are versions of history that say you didn't read a book on the Alamo, but you saw a couple movies, and that's what happened in history. And perhaps you might be reading the Richardson book, and you'll come across things that whoa, this is wrong because I don't remember history that way. Like the John Wayne movie I saw about Apaches doesn't have that in it.
Yeah.
And so, again, it's, we want to be self-conscious about all of this stuff.
Yeah.
We're not here to condemn ideas and that sort of thing. What we want to do is just make them self-conscious, right? And for you to be able to analyze, right?
Absolutely.
The game and put it into dialogue with sort of academic scholarship, academic philosophy. At the end of the day, it's just a class, and you'll move on. But
one of the things that this can do, both from the, at least in my opinion, from the viewpoint of both the history and the philosophy parts, are what this provides is a lot more context, right? And having more context and more information is just helpful to come to some kind of judgment or overall opinion at all, right? It makes it more informed, more nuanced, more reflective of various kinds of information, which just means that that's better.
Yeah,
right?
and to make the gratuitous liberal arts pitch, like that's the benefit of a liberal arts degree is.
That's right.
As we were talking earlier about diversity for diversity's sake, there's arguments, arguments, ethical arguments for all that stuff. But at the end of the day, if you're sitting around a table,
also instrumental or practical arguments.
If you're sitting around a table and everyone has the same thoughts and you're discussing a subject, you have just narrowed the space of possibilities for what you're discussing. And you most likely will make, as a group, the wrong decisions because you cannot see from a certain angle that you don't have experience seeing from. A liberal arts degree, it's not correcting some idea that you're going to get all these, but it allows you to figure out how to get different perspectives, how to ask questions about certain events that you take for granted. I do like coming across things that I take for granted. And then all of a sudden, I get to pick up the rock and look underneath and go, oh, right. And then it's like, oh my gosh, I was bought and sold on this sort of idea that I didn't have to think about. And now this undermined everything, right? And so that's right. It allows that kind of critical thinking to keep asking questions and to move forward.
So what do you? So we both looked at these first three essays, which is the subject. I think you're required to read one or two of them as students, but we went ahead and looked at all three of them. Which one do you want to start with, and what thoughts did you have on each of these, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, they're really good. They're fun, especially after you read it or play the game.
Yes,
it's like you're getting this weird tour.
Yes,
of various people's perspectives on the game. They're sort of
and different disciplinary perspectives. Right, there are people who are historians, people who are media studies people, American studies people, all kinds of different kind of perspectives. Right.
Yeah, but the one, the nerdy one that sticks out is chapter 1 about the database.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And it's more so in the sense of. Because I also teach stuff on film. I want to do a class on history television. I work with media and I work with historical, the relationship between history and media.
Sure.
And so I really like the way that this author sets this within a database culture because, post 1960s. Information age, the rise of big data. We live in big data. AI can't exist without big data. All this stuff's happening, and within the game here, you have this sense that, if film and television were some of the primary vehicles for teaching history, now you have these video games that do it on a level, but they can do it in a way that works like a database because you're inundated with such nuance. Again, thinking of the game, when you go into the doctor's offices, I think those are some of the most fascinating places. Or there's a recurring mission that you might get that is shockingly graphic. And it takes place where you rescue someone, take them to a doctor, and then something happens. And and here's the ethical dilemma in that you can leave or you can stay to watch.
Yeah.
And you're just thinking like, that is not what a doctor's office looks like today.
Sure.
This looks horrifying.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I don't think that you might get that in a film, but in a film, you're either forced to watch it or it's off camera.
Yeah.
Right?
And your choice is the thing that is.
And the second time you watch the film, it's the same.
Yeah.
So the second time you play the game, you can leave. Mm-hmm. Or maybe you left the first time.
Yeah, you can stay the next time.
And so it's just those little decisions in there, it does change. It changes the dynamics of even the Western as a genre, because you can't do that with a novel. I mean, the one that I keep, the version of this that I think that some listeners might, the choose your own adventure books. Like I did, I think I said earlier, the other part, I didn't read that much as a kid. But I loved Choose Your Own Adventure.
I liked those too. Those were a lot of fun.
had kind of control of it.
Yeah.
And
there's that agency, that interactivity.
Yeah.
That you had.
And you could read it a couple different ways.
Yeah.
And it moved and it changed shape.
Yeah.
And so I did appreciate that, the database essay. Yeah,
I thought that was really interesting, and certainly, again, this is a way that I'm not used to, I guess, thinking and talking about it. I did like this essay, and I liked the idea that that the game environment and the game mechanics allow you to engage with this. The medium basically, right, allows you to engage with the content in a way that's different than other medium forms, right? Other media. As a nitpicky philosopher, I found some of the, I thought some of the language was maybe stronger than it needed to be. Like when, sometimes writers will be like, well, this is essential and necessary or indispensable. And I just thought, I'm not so sure, right? I can imagine other ways this could be. So maybe that's too strong a claim, but still, I definitely thought it was interesting, the idea of thinking about the game world as interface and as a way to, mediate the person's experience and the genre as a whole, whatever that is. And I thought that, I also thought, again, I wasn't sure if I agreed at the end with the conclusion about how this particular kind of Western, what politics it requires or kind of what political outlook it requires. But I did think that was really interesting. And I do think that there's something to the idea that when you have so many open choices, when you don't have that kind of cause and effect, if you do this, this has to happen, linear structure, I do think, it makes sense to talk about that in the context of you're almost kind of just taking a step back and avoiding making a real choice because you can make any choice and the consequences don't really matter or something. Mm-hmm. I thought that was interesting to think about, what politics is in the game ultimately or something. So do you have any other thoughts on that first essay or other things you wanted to highlight? Oh, no, I'm good with that. Okay. Do you want to go to the second or the third? Up to you. What was your sort of the essay that stood out? So the essay that stood out to me, I certainly enjoyed the first and second one, and we'll come back to the second one by Lawler. But I found the third essay by Robert Whitaker really interesting. And again, this is coming from a person who does not have a history background, and so most of what I know does probably come from, half-remembered history classes in high school or college, or the little bits of reading and, of course, pop culture exposure to these things. But I did not really have any sense of how close the Red Dead games hew to actual historical events in terms of private police forces and how do you deal with enforcing law in this kind of widely spread geographic area. How you get privatized, this particular police force protects these people because they have the money to pay them, and then you start getting uniforms and the way that the Pinkertons are connected to what would eventually become the FBI and investigation, all of that I thought was something that was just super interesting. I didn't really know very much about, and I certainly would not have. Again, I'm playing the game and observing the game just like you and like anyone else is, but I guess I would not have. Red Dead Redemption 2 does seem like a game that cares about history and cares about geography. So it does seem like there is, as I think as this book in the intro says, it seems very lovingly detailed and crafted with a lot of hours, right, of people putting into it and pouring their time and effort and expertise in it. But I guess I did not think, oh yeah, that's probably how this roughly happened or something, in terms of the Pinkertons and the transition from the main Pinkerton character in Red Dead 2 to now he's like the head of the OBI or whatever in the first Red Dead, right? Like, I did not think any of that. I would not have thought, oh, that's like totally the way things happened and developed.
Yeah.
And him discussing and kind of demonstrating that kind of blew me away. So I really enjoyed that, and it certainly was something that I learned a great deal from. At least I thought. What did you think about that third essay?
Yeah, no, I loved it because I've always been interested in the Pinkertons. They're the, when we think of the rise of industrial capitalism, that also comes with sort of that Western, post-Civil War arrival of,
robber barons.
This obviously begins, the California gold rush in the late 40s.
Sure, yeah.
But the moment you have these large sort of capital-intensive companies moving into these territories are lawless in a way.
Yeah.
And so, of course, there's a market for, if there are groups like the O'Driscolls.
Yeah. And the Vanderland gang.
And the Vanderland, of course you need, if you're a company to,
you protect your investment.
You got to hire these. Happy. Yeah. You have to hire these people. And you do see the Pinkertons pop up in pop culture. Like, I think Deadwood's a really good example of eventually, this guy comes and the Pinkertons are obviously these the villains in it. Another movie, underrated, it's from 1970 with Sean Connery.
Okay.
Called The Molly Maguires.
Okay.
And that movie is it's about the Pinkertons infiltrating a group of sort of Irish coal miners. And it's like one of the best beginnings of a film ever. I won't say what it happens.
Okay.
It's like cool. If I show the film, I usually just show the beginning until it hits the credits, and then I'm like, okay, we're done.
All right.
Because it's kind of like that's all you need to know.
Yeah. I also thought the discussion of like private police forces in reference to like breaking up unions and labor movements, that's also nuts. I mean, I had known a little bit of the history of like how like, again, once their like authorized police forces interfered with certain kinds of labor movements or something, but and it makes sense. I just didn't know that this was also something the Pinkertons and other private security groups would have been doing too. So. Yeah,
and I think that's a part of the logic of the era.
Sure.
Teaching any kind of history, especially, world history.
Yeah.
This era, people think, because you've heard it so many times, different versions, people think that everyone kind of knew what was going to happen. And you always have to remember that, in 1800, they didn't really know what a big factory was.
Yeah.
You didn't know what would happen if you have 100 or 500 people working for you on that level.
Yeah.
Right. Slave plantations were a version of it. Right. So you had these ideas, and that's where factories utilized how to run a slave plantation manuals to basically figure out how do you run this sort of, this factory with these free labor people that are working for you. But I do think that, if you have a group of people that are free and suddenly they're protesting against unfair policies or pay or working conditions, and they refuse to work, and and then a tension and conflict develops.
Yeah. Eventually
you have to come in with force to crush sort of the resistance, right? To protect your scabs that come in during the strike or something like that.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what would happen with a lot of law enforcement. Law enforcement gets drawn in because of, who runs the city. Well, the city is in, they want the company there because there's kickbacks and, kind of that like old fashioned corruption.
Yeah.
But a private army always, because the private army is a citizen and the citizen has a contract it's protecting property
Yeah.
that is completely legal. How you protect it can be argued in court.
Sure.
Again, it's the morals and ethics of how you protect the property. And so for me, the private armies, which are back around, obviously, again, the favorite part of that chapter is that, what is it? What's the company here? Securitas AB.
Oh, yeah, suing Red Dead.
I can only imagine there's probably a company that changes its name. Let's look that up. But Securitas AB tried to sue Rockstar to get the Pinkertons out of the game because it was giving the Pinkertons a bad name.
So Securitas merged with Pinkerton in 1999.
Okay. What was Securitas AB before, though? Did they have?
They were just Securitas. And
Okay.
they were another security company.
Okay.
So.
It'd be interesting to see does it say when they were
founded,
incorporated?
So Securitas is a European company.
Okay.
And it looks like they've been listed on the stock exchange since 1991.
Okay.
Whereas the Pinkertons are
go way back,
at least
55,
1800 or something. Yeah.
So, but you have this instance where a video game is being sued by a company that owns the brand, basically, of the Pinkertons. And they're mad because they're giving the Pinkertons a bad name.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's a video, it's just so ripe.
Yeah.
With, again, the game is always in the present.
Yeah.
The present intrudes on.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, there's even another tension there, right? Which is just, the Pinkerton himself starting out as basically being driven from the UK for his work to try to get suffrage for non-landed white men or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
That's such a weird thing to then go to the US, become part of kind of this middle class or ruling class, and then be now I'm gonna employ and develop this whole thing that basically, and again, at least as presented in our text, it initially starts from wanting to protect some of these local investments from these people where it's a lawless area, and then it becomes this thing where it's it's doing the stuff that the founder was not wanting to happen, right? And he was getting the Cardists, or I can't remember the name of it, the particular movement in Ireland, they were getting people coming down hard on them and getting rid of people because they didn't want them to upset kind of this order. And then, it comes full circle, and he develops a group that helps people not, tamp down efforts to upset the order of things. I just thought that was really a rich irony.
It's definitely plays into perhaps things aren't contradictions, right? Perhaps there's other things going on. I always kind of I've begun to kind of squirm when I hear something's a contradiction, because maybe it's not a contradiction.
Sure.
Right, maybe there's something else going on.
It might be on the face of a contradiction, but it's not really contradictory.
And of course, it's defined as a contradiction. I'm not saying contradictions don't exist.
Sure, yeah.
But I think in practice, there's something else going on besides just writing it off as a contradiction.
Okay, sure.
It's something you're now in a position of power.
Yeah.
You've brought your experience as someone working on that side to this other side, and you're good at it. You're good at undermining because you were there once, right? And that what does that say about culture and power, right? All
human
of a sudden,
nature, human beings.
Yeah, it's of course you're going to be once you're wealthy, you can afford to be a libertarian, right?
Sure,
you can afford to talk about the West and rugged individualism without talking about federal intervention or something like that.
And certainly one of the pre-reads for our course, right, is a little bit of it's a cowboy ethics thing that is drawn from this guy who is a business person, who's a CEO of a bunch of companies, not a cowboy.
Yeah,
right.
But likes to see themselves as
absolutely. So.
And that was big. Again, going back in the 70s and 80s, there was a resurgence of corporate CEOs framing themselves as cowboys.
Okay, I didn't know that.
So there's some literature out there that talks about that.
Huh, okay.
And so and it's funny because it echoes that turn of the century, 100 years before,
Yeah.
where, like someone like Teddy Roosevelt's like, everyone's getting soft. We need to start playing sports like football. And so the rise of sports during this time is this compensation for this idea.
It's a way to channel this kind of aggressive or violent urge.
And it's to show that, despite sort of our comfort, we are legitimate. Right. It comes down to that. We are legitimate leaders of the tribe that are going to go out and get that mammoth.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, I can still carry the spear and take down the mammoth for the
right.
glory of our wandering group of hunters and gatherers.
Yeah. Well, and that maybe leads into very nicely like ideas about, masculinity and stuff, which is the subject of our second essay. So.
Yeah, and I think when you play the game, you have to be Arthur. Right?
Yeah.
You don't get to choose.
That's right.
And Arthur is, I would say, a reconstructed masculinity.
Okay.
Right. I would say that there's a version of him where he accepts Sadie as kind of a chuckle, but then there's real respect.
Yeah.
Because there's so many times that Sadie takes the lead, like defending.
Yeah, and he realizes, she's
a little
just
bit
as much of an
more.
individual and an agent.
Yeah. And then in the epilogue too, there's that part which I won't talk about. But I think I always thought of like Patrick Swayze as he was the reformed John Wayne.
Okay.
Right? Like he still had all the rugged, tough, but he also could do Tai Chi.
Yeah.
He could dance.
Sure.
And he wasn't so rough with women.
Yeah.
Right? It wasn't John Wayne throwing, a woman over his knee to spank her because she did wrong. Like,
sure.
It's sort of, and so Arthur kind of fits into this. Like, how do we regenerate this ideal American masculine? And it's usually through sort of a white male. How do you regenerate it, but you kind of scrape away the bad stuff that we don't want to talk about?
Or maybe that just we, or maybe the creators of the game just don't think has a place anymore. So I think, for example, about the discussion at the beginning of how you've got to have some unpleasantness, but it's a game, so you want to like not do everything super unpleasant. And part of that, I think, is just like changing attitudes too. So again, one of the pre-reads that they had for the course has like 2 different cowboy codes, and one is the kind of from the manager, but the other one I think is like something that maybe Gene Autry supposedly wrote or something. And that one includes things like, being respectful to like women and not discriminating on the basis of race or religion. And it's like, well, probably that wasn't how it was to be a cowboy, right? And so there is, I think, this, as you said, kind of updating or modifying of this thing in a way that like, we want to remove the bad stuff but keep hold of the good stuff. It's a very human nature thing, right? We always want to have our cake and eat it too. We want to get rid of all the problems with a view but keep all the strengths of the view. Right? It's this kind of dialectical way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because this game comes around, amidst sort of these debates, and again throwing the cultural relativists throwing mud at the term woke and all that. So and the idea, like, I'm sure there's fans out there that hate Sadie.
Sure.
Right? Like, that's unreal, blah, blah. So there's...
In the name of realism.
In the name of realism. But then is that realism also your own ideal of the cowboy code?
Exactly.
Right? So it's where we especially as we're going through the class, we want to interrogate all that. Mm-hmm. So
sure, absolutely.
And we haven't really said this yet. You should try to keep an eye on, if you're on, Facebook has them, and then Reddit also has them. There's these different subreddits, or on Facebook there's certain,
groups or whatever. Yeah,
you might join those just to look at the conversations.
Yeah, what are people talking about?
Yeah.
What are they saying?
Sometimes people say, do really kind of ethically mean things. People make good points. Really, what you're doing is you're just kind of watching the conversation outside of the readings we're doing in
Absolutely,
here. And you also learn things too that,
yes,
if you've ever gone to this thing, I've never seen it. I've played it for X number of years.
Yeah.
But again, all this, these games here we're obviously, arguably in the golden age of these first-person shooters.
Yeah, especially these big sandbox games.
Yeah, we're on the verge of VR. Mm-hmm. I don't think we're there yet. It's too expensive. It's too awkward. Mm-hmm. I remember I grabbed one a couple years ago. I immediately bought Fallout 4, mm-hmm. and I only got to Sanctuary, and at that point I felt car sick. And that lasted the rest of the day. And I don't even think I haven't even picked it up since. Yeah.
There's a lot of things to work on in the technology.
Yeah, but
in terms of immersiveness,
doing Fallout that way, that was incredible. Yeah. Or the other one I bought was the Star Wars Rogue. Mm-hmm. You're flying ships around. Yeah. And so you got to be in a TIE fighter. And that was insane. Like, I'm inside a TIE fighter flying.
That's right.
That one I didn't get, quote, car sick.
Sure.
I'd probably go back and play that. I think that the car sick just kind of threw me off, and I never went back.
But the point, of course, is just that games are at a level where they're so immersive and the environment is so rich that you can do a lot of stuff in it, and a lot of information can be contained in how the game presents certain things. And
but I guess it arrives at this moment, right? Because if it starts in 92, we'll just stick with 92. Sure. It arrives at this moment of and this begins in the 60s, but that sort of the downfall of this old school masculinity that was all about sort of controlling women, right? Which you have second wave feminism come in the 70s, but the real marker is the 1964 Civil Rights Act that was originally anchored towards eliminating racial distinction or bias, racial bias in hiring practices. Yeah. But a Southern segregationists, to derail everything, inserted sex at the last moment, thinking, the people that are for this, they'll never be for this. Yeah. And it was voted through, and everyone all of a sudden, it got silent, and they just basically realized, oh my gosh, we just gave half the population of the United States, women, equal rights or civil rights, a way to sue for discrimination against women. Yeah. And that opens the door, right? And again, absolutely. We were talking about the binaries of whiteness, freedom, blackness, slavery, that colonial into the 19th century through today, arguably. Masculinity comes under attack because if you don't have, if you can't control women and imagine them as dependent, and then you're this masculine person with agency, what is masculinity then? Right, like masculinity suddenly loses.
If it's defined or required by this other thing.
And so really, beginning the 70s is a weird moment. If you think of movies, The Lonely Man, usually it's white men. The Lonely Man cinema of the 70s. Dirty Harry is really a person who's always alone. The Conversation, right? Harry Call from 1974. The Conversation. Okay. Gene Hackman really embodied the lonely man. Okay. Right.
As a trope.
As a trope. The Shining. Okay. I would say even Taxi Driver to an extent.
Sure.
Grappling with a world that is changing.
Sure.
And it's not what it was in the 50s, where you have Leave It to Beaver and this level of confidence. Sure. And you can always think of any John Wayne movie. Like, John Wayne could just enter a scene and he dominated through the movie. You go into the 80s, you have the rise of these absurd action films with, predominantly white heroes, but the masculinity now needs to have this hyper component.
Sure.
Because you couldn't just be, like, John Wayne didn't lift weights.
Yeah.
And he didn't work out.
Yeah.
He just showed up. He didn't have to do any of those other things. Now you're Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, you have incredible karate skills or something.
Sure.
But you're a superhuman. You're a superhero.
Yeah.
And that helps to, it's like this weird fake regeneration of a masculinity.
Yeah.
Then you enter the 90s, and again, you're 20 years into social equality now. And suddenly there are women in CEO positions. There are women that are in positions of power.
Yeah.
And you go through another round of what is masculinity then? And I think this is a good point, and this is that 9/11 moment. Because 9/11 happens, never forget, you're using the language of that goes back to the Alamo, that goes back to various moments in history, Pearl Harbor.
Yeah.
Right. And that all is going back to the so-called Indian sneak attack on the settler. They the treacherous sneak attack. And then the trope of the man will defend, with the cult.
Yeah.
And 9/11 happens, and that resurrects, right, that level of masculinity.
Yeah.
And you have kind of a return of some of these. Like I've never seen them, but the Taken series.
Oh yeah.
Right, the Taken series, 24, the television. And arguably this kind of has a trajectory that goes through Obama and up to our own present, where like thinking of that commencement, we're at a point where we have to re-instruct people, what are your proper roles, right? And there's that line in there where he says, you've been brainwashed this whole time.
Yeah.
So, again, if it's been 50 years of social equality legislation for people of color and women, we're now in a period where if you want your ideals, which is the sort of, if men are out working, women are in the home, if you want those to work, you have to re-educate. But it comes off clumsy because you didn't have to do any of that in the 50s.
Yeah.
You kind of did, actually. You could see the advertisements because women were in the factories. So you had to educate society again. Yeah. You could argue that that's clumsy too.
Sure.
But you didn't have to do that really in the 20s or the teens.
Yeah.
Right. It's sort of, there's a level of autopilot.
It had been ingrained enough in deep-seated cultural structures or something that you could just rely on that as for the transmission of the role, like the role-based idea of this is where you should be or what you should do or something like that.
Yeah, and this is getting to the point. The whole Red Dead series has rode through that. I think the first one's in 2004. Yeah. But Red Dead 2 really goes the furthest, I think, according to the. I've never played the earlier ones because I think that the first one was only on console. So I don't even know if I can get it on PC, but it's interesting that you're at a point, like, again, you have to play Arthur, but you have, like, Sadie represents this other version. There's a few women in the group that kind of fit into the older models, but they all have different agency as well. Arguably, they're more realistic historically, right? So then that troubles, right? Like, I guess a question as you're playing the game is, what were women doing at that period? Kind of the strange things that we're not taught, that are not in John Wayne movies, that are not, sort of circulated in that popular images of the past. And to me, like, as a historian of all this, like, reading the blogs and the Reddits and, like, that's the things that I'm really interested in, is when people get really mad about a female character that is doing something that in their eyes they shouldn't be doing. This is wrong. Right. And it hits on the moral, because to them this is an atrocity. Right. This shouldn't be happening. I can't believe that X company, whatever company, is allowing this. Disney, right? Disney is always a good villain in this. And I guess, to kind of sum up, at least that essay, it's, everything is written and produced in its own time. The game, has, it plays into the trope of the violent father figure, but at the same time, it does offer these glimpses of characters, women characters that aren't fitting a traditional role.
Sure, absolutely, yeah.
And again, the question is, what if the game was made 30 years ago, 50 years ago?
Sure, yeah.
How would that have played out? Because you wouldn't have had that. It would have been a real absurdity in a popular mind to have certain things. I guess there's the famous, I think Fathers Knows Best, and it's a late 50s sitcom, right? Which Father Knows Best gives you a really good idea of the time, right, as a popular sitcom. But it's Betty the engineer, and Betty wants to be an engineer. She doesn't want to try on the dress that through the whole episode it just came in the mail. Okay. I bought you this dress, you won't try it on. Yeah. And she only tries it on at the end when the engineer, who is really horrible to her because they go on a job training through high school, and he was just mean, but he likes her. And then she finally tries on the dress, and then all of a sudden she assumes the proper role. Yeah. And then credits. Yeah. Right. And so it's, that's itself is a teaching, right? Like you would watch that episode and go, oh, boy, how silly was it for Betty to think that she'd be
insofar as it has that kind of didactic purpose. That's what you're supposed to take away from it or something. So I thought this was interesting. I think that this is going to be, this is going to be one of the areas that I think I really look forward to in teaching the course with you and in talking with our students is, my own background is not, I guess, not as much in like what I would describe as like feminist philosophy or feminist theory or something like that. And so some of the stuff when I was reading in the second chapter, I just didn't find as plausible, just in the sense of like saying, and again, some of this might just be like my being a philosopher and quibbling with precise language use or something. But, when the author says like, what this shows is the essential, necessary, indispensable nature of manhood as this individualized, rugged thing. I guess part of what I was thinking when I was playing the game is like, I actually don't think that's a very accurate way of depicting what's going on in the game, right? I mean, part of the point of the game is that like you as Arthur actually don't get along very well if you don't have all of these other people, right, contributing to the camp, whether that's like, the guy that's doing the cooking or whether it's the woman that at the very first gets bed set up for everybody. Like, I think that certainly one way to understand and interpret what's happening in the game is, and again, there's no question that there's a lot of focus on this rugged individualism, and I do think that, I don't think it is false that is like often, and even in the game, like gendered in a certain way. But I guess I also think that like Sadie as a character, I thought Sadie as a character actually really complicates the story of the chapter, of that particular author's chapter, because she's kind of just ignored and brushed aside really quickly, partly because she, I think, goes against a lot of what the idea in that chapter is about, like how much of the focus in the game is this kind of particularly and purely patriarchal kind of thing in terms of agency, and the idea that there's like good masculinity and bad masculinity, there's good fathers and bad fathers, and what that really turns out to is the ones who are willing to be violent but also loyal and stuff. Like, I think that again, I think that's true. I guess I think that, philosophers, and I guess, my own background especially is I'm really interested in comparative philosophy. Like, one of the areas that I studied a lot in grad school was Chinese philosophy. And there's no question that like what Confucius or Kongzi was doing is very, very different culturally, linguistically, in terms of like ideas about sex and gender and economics and political society, the function of government. Like, all that is vastly different from either Plato and Socrates or from how we think about it now. But I guess, I think that there is enough like universal humanness to all of these things that like I can read Confucius and be like, oh, even though we spoke different languages and we're so totally different culturally and we're removed in time so far, I also worry about that exact same question, right? And so some of the things that Lawler identifies as being specifically, I guess I would say like patriarchal or focused on masculinity, some of that just seems to me more just like human or something, right? So this is one of the things I think is going to be really interesting and I'm looking forward to is like, you're going to help me think about this and learn about it. And, I'm going to give you some objections or some other ways to think about it when we talk about it. I think that'll be useful, I think, and helpful. So,
I think too.
I don't think, to be clear, I don't think it's like a lens you can't use.
Yeah.
I don't think that like thinking about it this way should be forbidden or off limits or anything like that. I think it is absolutely like a useful and a relevant way to talk and think about this stuff, and an important way to do it. I guess some of the way that it was phrased in the chapter was like, this is the determinate only major, this is definitely what's going on. And I thought the game is so rich with various kinds of meaning and with what it's suggesting that I think that you could interpret things in a number of different ways, right?
Yeah.
Outside of just that particular gender binary or something like that.
No, yeah. There's always the binary. I guess the essential language part would be, you do get various levels of the fatherly manhood.
Sure.
You get this broad spectrum.
Sure.
And then you just have Sadie. Right? Like that's the big difference. Or, when you go into stores, usually it's a man and they're selling something. So you get this wide spectrum of the masculine experience. And this is where it's like
there's femininity is much shallower.
It's sort of I don't want to say token because again it's you can only expect so much. Like the video game industry is very white male dominated.
Sure.
I do think they tried to go out of their way to pull in the viewpoints and and bring in different. But there's the expectation is you do get a broad spectrum of white male agency,
or just male agency. Right, I mean,
I'd say white male agency in the sense that
I'm thinking of like Lenny, Javier. And...
Well, you get, but even those detailed, you only get a few. Again, compared to all these people you run into, right? Either the photographer, the painter guy. I guess the one that sticks out is the woman who loses her husband up in the north.
Okay.
And you teach her how to shoot.
Sure.
Right. So she's an exception.
Yeah.
The woman you save who then goes into prostitution. I think there's one of those.
Sure.
But they're kind of extremes. Like one's prostitute save, upper class, clueless about living in a cabin. And then Sadie has to go through sexual assault and basically the liberation,
tragedy,
the
death of her husband, the destruction of her home,
to become an agent.
Sure.
The other one would be the last gunslinger, who is the woman, and then she has a place wired with explosives or something like that. I guess I'd have to go back and see the detailed parts.
Sure.
But I think in general, the game still kind of speaks to that. And again, I think this is where people expect too much, because if it's entertainment, it has to be entertainment.
Yeah.
It has to please shareholders.
Sure.
It has to make money, and arguably they always have to target their core audience.
Sure. Yeah.
Right. And core audience, not so much now, but it's all
still a big portion,
but
right?
A very white male audience.
Sure. Absolutely.
Of people that you need to keep playing the game.
Yeah.
Right. And
absolutely.
to buy the next one, or to buy the DLCs or something like that.
Yeah, that's right.
But this will be an interesting sort of, I hope people will write about it.
Yeah, me too.
In the discussion board part of the class.
Yeah.
Because it's complicated, right? I think that's the
absolutely.
main, the main thing
no
is
question.
there's a level of complication to it.
Yeah.
So, that's kind of it for today. I think we're about 2 hours and 18 minutes. We actually plan on we're going to have an hour.
Yeah.
But I do think this might be one of these, an hour and a half to 2 hours.
Especially, this is a 4-week summer class. So if you think about this in a traditional class structure, we're trying to do a podcast to cover material that in a full 16-week course we would do over the course of 4 weeks, and we're doing it all in 1 week.
Yeah,
right?
1 week.
So if you think of if we would give a 30-minute lecture, say, for an online single week of class, around that in this one. We will of course try to be a little more careful with our time and maybe manage it a little better. But yeah, it looks like an hour and a half to 2 is probably the likelihood of where we're aiming for. So, or where we're going to end up, even though we're aiming, as Dan said initially, for about an hour.
Yeah. So. But the other, we've listed in the syllabus films that if you're interested to watch. Mm-hmm. We threw in The Unforgiven from 1992. Mm-hmm. It's a really good late Western, Clint Eastwood. I think he directed it. It's something to watch. It's always, as long as you're taking the class and sort of swimming through all these readings and playing the game, it's always useful to up the ante and then watch a film that has connections to it, because it always... Again, you're not watching the film necessarily for historical content. You're watching it for, here's an expression from 1992 about an idea of the West. But this is an idea of the West, a late West. Yeah. Right? This is the end where you have these sort of gunslinger types that are past retirement age. I mean, they're in their 60s. Long
in the tooth.
Right? Yeah. So... Anyway, on that note, I think we'll wrap it up, and we will talk to you again in 1 week.
That's right. Thanks, Dan, for talking with me about the history of Red Dead Redemption and just the history of history. And this was a lot of fun. Yeah. So I look forward to doing it again soon.
Yeah.
Thanks, everybody.